Misconceptions that people have about vintage motorcycles. It seems like there's a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions when it comes down to vintage bikes. You have the old heads who bought the bikes brand new and made opinions back in the 70s. You have people who owned them in the 90s in disrepair. And now you have people buying cafe racers that are half taken apart that hate these bikes. Motorcycling really has this time period when we're talking about vintage bikes. In all reality, we're talking about bikes in the 70s and 80s, but I would consider bikes even of the 50s and 60s to fall into this category. Anything before that I think would be considered classic. Anything before the 30s I think would be considered antique. A lot of people have opinions on these bikes and some of them are just completely wrong nowadays. Maybe in the past some of these things were apparent, but honestly, I still think a lot of people are just plain out wrong. Motorcycling has changed a lot since the 70s, 80s, 90s, parts availability, all of those things. The first thing that people get wrong are the fact that vintage bikes don't have any parts. When it comes down to it, vintage bikes have a ton of people who are reproducing parts, selling the exact things you need. Take my Triumph Bonneville for example. There are many websites that have every single part that I would ever need for the motorcycle. A lot of the parts are going to be remanufactured, original parts from Triumph. Well, they don't exist because Triumph as a company doesn't exist as it did back then. Most of these British manufacturers went completely bankrupt. When it comes to the Japanese bikes, specific parts like carburetor parts, well, the manufacturers didn't make those in the first place. Some of the things like the handlebar grips, things like that, some of those are still available from Honda, and if they aren't, someone is most likely making them aftermarket. In the early 2010s, maybe the late 2000s, some of these parts weren't as available as they were now. I remember my dad was looking for pipes for his CB750 and they really didn't exist. Once they started to roll around, they were astronomically priced and you couldn't justify it because you could buy 7 bikes for the same price. Now those bikes have rose in value, but also the parts have become a little bit cheaper. When you're looking at a rare machine that was produced with less than a couple hundred models made, it's going to be very hard to get parts. But that's kind of apparent with any single thing that's out there. Luckily for most of us, most of these old vintage bikes were produced by the couple of thousands at the bare minimum. A couple of thousands is still a very rare machine, and there's most likely someone out there with some type of solution or some type of aftermarket part that can work for your motorcycle to get it back on the road. So the misconception of parts are no longer available and it's impossible to fix them is completely wrong. Predating the internet, I can understand how some of these parts were probably really hard to get, really hard to find. You had to know the right people, you had to have the right contacts, and that's not always possible. The next thing, and something I hear very often, is you can never find anyone to work on them. You have to be your own master technician in order to own a vintage bike. They're constantly breaking down, they'll constantly have problems. I would say that if you want to own one of these bikes, you're either going to learn some mechanical stuff or you should know some mechanical stuff or at least be open to it. These bikes are pretty simple to work on, but there are plenty of fantastic mechanics. Most likely you have someone in your area who works on motorcycles. Yes, they're not going to be cheap necessarily because if you want it done correctly, you want to pay someone the correct money for it. When I'm out on primarily one of my old British bikes, I hear a lot of people coming up to me and saying, yeah, but it's impossible to find anyone to work on them. You're never going to be able to have someone who's going to be able to fix it if something goes wrong, when that's not necessarily true. And if you're looking to work on them yourself, these bikes are pretty simple when it comes down to it. There's tons of information available on it, and you can really fix them if you wanted to. And the next thing about them being unreliable isn't necessarily true. A properly well-maintained bike, primarily a properly well-maintained Japanese bike, will basically last you a lifetime. Yes, some of these bikes are now getting to the age where they need to be semi-restored, perhaps rebuilt, top ends need to be rebuilt, perhaps they've been sitting for a few years, so they're going to need things. When anything gets old, things begin to deteriorate. It's a simple part of maintaining a motorcycle, and if a bike has been neglected, it's going to need more than a bike that has been properly cared for. If you take care of the things when they pop up, rather than waiting until they get really bad, you're most likely going to have a more positive experience with the bike. If you buy a bike that's a basket case, a bike that's missing a ton of parts, a bike that has been cafe raced poorly, you're probably not going to have a great experience with the bike. There are certain models that do have problems, and for the most part, a lot of people have found fixes to them. Do the research, of course, before buying any specific model that's out there. A lot of problems that were from the 70s are no longer problems now because a lot of riders would complain about these bikes. Which brings us into the next point. They're old, they're slow, they vibrate like crazy, they don't stop, and they're just not good bikes to ride. I mainly hear this from people who are buying the bikes from brand new. Back in the 70s when people bought them, they complained about them, and some of those things just don't exist anymore. But before we get into that, did you know that most of you guys who are watching this video, coming back to the video, supporting the channel, aren't subscribed? Go down, hit the subscribe button, and help the channel out greatly. People who bought these motorcycles brand new had very minute issues with them. The bike didn't handle great, the bike didn't brake great, this bike did this better. But when it comes down to it now, you can go out and buy a bike from the mid-2000s that will beat every single vintage bike out there. So when it comes down to performance, handling, all of those things are basically very minute when comparing one to another. When riding a vintage bike, you have to be a little bit more attentive. Most of these vintage bikes only had single discs, if they even had a disc brake and they had drums. There's nothing wrong with the drum brake, and I think that's another misconception that people have. You just have to be aware of the motorcycle and ride it in its limits. When it comes down to riding the bikes, yeah, these bikes are going to be a little bit more lively. They're going to have soul. That's kind of what brings the soul into these bikes. They're going to shake a little bit. They're going to have their own quirky handling, and that's just something that they are. But when you get on a motorcycle like a CB750, one of the best motorcycles ever created, it really rides like a new bike. It's going to have some downsides because, again, it is a 50-plus-year-old motorcycle, but when it comes down to the riding aspect of the bike, it's very similar to modern motorcycles. And some people say that they're slow, but I think that's absolutely not the case. If you want to go fast, go buy a liter bike. Go buy a 600. Those bikes are going to outperform any old vintage bike. But you can't necessarily say that these motorcycles are slow. A lot of these motorcycles pack a good amount of power, especially some of the old British 500 singles, the high compression bikes. They make a substantial amount of power. The CB750 in and of itself makes a good amount of power. You're definitely not going to be like, oh, this thing is underpowered, I wish it would go faster. I think the people who say that they ride like garbage or handle like garbage either bought them newer and are comparing them to other bikes at the time, like you're comparing an old XS to a Triumph Bonneville where one is way more smooth than the other is, or in your head you support one brand while you don't like the other brand because it's making a direct competitor, so you automatically think one bike is way better than the other bike, or you rode a very bad example of a vintage bike. I think those are the two categories and it boils down to it. Or the third, you've never actually been on one of these bikes and you kind of just formed an opinion based off of other people's opinions. It's not going to be the fastest thing in the world, but it's going to have a ton of soul, you're going to have a ton of fun with it, and you're going to learn more about the bike than you would with a modern motorcycle. With a modern motorcycle, you're going to go take it in for a warranty repair, while with an old bike, you'll be able to diagnose the problem yourself. You get a little bit more hands-on with it, which I think is half the fun of owning a bike. Being able to ride them and enjoy them is a huge part of it, but I think repairing them, fixing them, keeping them on the road, and just curating these motorcycles that are pieces of art and pieces of history is a huge thing. A lot of people talk down on these older motorcycles and have misconceptions about them leaking oil and being horrible, and some of those things are true. British bikes would like to mark their territory, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're unreliable, they won't start, you can never ride them, they're going to be constant nightmares. Because I hear that basically on a consistent basis, whether I make a video on an older bike, whether I have one of my older bikes and I'm riding it at a gas station, at a meet, whatever it is, whenever I'm surrounded by vintage bikes, I will always hear at least a few people say, I would love to own one if they weren't so unreliable. If you buy a proper bike, you maintain it properly, and you're open to the fact that it will have some issues, you're going to have a fun time on the bike. That's all I have for the video. If you guys enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.